and to Jewish studies and history and whomever else was involved in bringing me here. I came to MSU, oh my goodness, when I was still in Wisconsin some years ago to do talk and had a wonderful time. We actually, I think, got these short videos on MSU to work, which is good for your aesthetic sensibilities, because if they didn't, I was going to have to fill the evening with some of my favorite country and western tunes. Well, I would have really enjoyed that. I grew up in Michigan, moved to Michigan in 1957, and I just wanted to mention this may be the most stunning thing I say all night. One of my first memories of moving to Michigan in 1957, the Detroit Lions won the NFL championship. Words that don't often go together. I remember Tobin Rote as quarterback and all of those good things. So I have two quick things to say before we get into all this stuff. First one is that I've had this really awful cold for like 2 weeks, so my voice is sort of like the Russian army marched through it. So please forgive me for that. Secondly, the second short thing I'm going to show you is some clips from the final film at the Holocaust Memorial Museum. Some of you I'm sure have seen, called Testimony. And in the transmission of it from a VHS to the DVD, somehow the technical gods were angry with me and the voices are a little out of sync. It's really irritating, and I've had people that know way more about this try. It's irritating, but you can get through these. So I've only done this presentation one time before, so I hope you find it interesting. If not, I'm leaving town tomorrow. So I had these 3 clips from different projects that I was involved with, and I kept using them in classes, and I would use like one of them or 2 of them in different presentations. I thought, what about thinking about the power of oral history and just using all 3 of these? So the first clip I'm going to show you, I had a good friend who, I did a lot of work with the National Park Service, a good friend who was the director of the oral history program at the Tuskegee National Airmen Historic Site. And these are just absolutely stunning videos of these guys. And now there's a project to do their lives as well. So this is a very brief clip of Lieutenant Colonel Charles W. Dryden, who is going to talk with you about his experience when he came back from Europe, having fought for the United States Army Air Force in Europe, and his experiences coming back to the United States. The second clip will be some selections from testimony from the Holocaust Museum, and the third clip is going to be some first responders from Oklahoma City. Those of you who may not remember ancient modern American history, the Oklahoma City bombing, April 19th, 1995, largest act of domestic terrorism in American history. If we think of 9/11 as international terrorism, it still is. Killed 168 people, wounded several hundred more, ripped an entire community apart. It was a major, major, major event in American history. Not the least of which because it was much more uncomfortable to think about who the perpetrators were. Right? Decorated Gulf War veteran, the murder of 19 children in the daycare center in the Alfred P. Mira Federal Building added certainly a level of horror to this event. And I happened to be in Oklahoma City when they were interviewing the different teams that were going to come in and do the Memorial Center. And one of the teams had already done some oral history with first responders from Virginia. And there wasn't a dry eye in the room when we finished watching this. If you go to the Oklahoma City National Memorial, you'll see much more of this, but I'm going to play you about 6 minutes of this. So I want to think both about them and then think out of them, at least the kinds of things that lead me to think about the promise of oral history, and for me anyway, these things in particular. Okay? So we start with Lieutenant Colonel Charles W. Dryden.
That we had won a victory, but it wasn't true because it was a Major General, Frank O'Driscoll Hunter, who was the commanding general of 1st Air Force, and he used his prerogative to move the entire training unit from South Richfield, Michigan, outside of Detroit, to Walterboro, South Carolina. Now we get to the point of the story.
Tell me about the train ride down there.
Huh?
The train ride to Walterboro?
Yeah, overnight train ride. We didn't know where we were going. We boarded the train at night, and the first stations that we saw through the windows were stations in Canada. So we've been transported over into Canada, and then back to the States and down through the Mohawk Valley in the state of New York. We recognized Pennsylvania Station, and New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Washington, D.C., Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. And we ended up at Walterboro, South Carolina, deep in the South. When the train pulled up at a siding, there were armed guards about every 100 yards with carbines, nothing but trees all around. So the first thought occurred to me and the rest of us was that we were being interned as the Japanese Americans had been out on the West Coast. But it turned out it was an Army air base where we were going to be trained. And when we got off the train, we were taken by truck to some World War I type of shanty barracks. Very basic accommodations, a cot, a steel cot, a mattress, no mattress covers, no pillow slips or anything like that. So the guys decided to, it was a Sunday that we arrived, they decided to go find a movie and see a movie and relax. And I wanted to make sure that all the men had at least quarters and so forth, since I was a senior ranking. Not by any designation, it's just that everybody sort of looked up to the fact that my classmates and myself were, and I was the only one of my classmates who was sent back as an instructor. So I made sure that everybody was billeted and had some sort of basic accommodation. So I took the time taking my shower, and I put on a fresh uniform and walked down a pathway to the theater. And it's almost like the boondocks, you know. And I arrived at the theater. It was about a 3/4 mile walk. The guys were all standing in formation. And there were just a couple of pilots of enlisted men who had gone to the movie. So as I approached the theater, there was a second lieutenant, Bayless, who called the men to attention, and he reported to me. He says, Lieutenant Dryden, Lieutenant Bayless reporting. So I said, Bayless, what's going on here? He said, well, we went into the theater, and there was a rope down the middle of the theater, blacks on one side, whites on the other. So the men promptly cut the rope, and they sat, they checkerboarded, 2 over here, 1 there, all over the place. So the tech sergeant, who was the theater operator, movie operator, refused to start the film until they restored the segregated seating order. And so the men decided to file out of the theater and call the officer of the day, which they did. And after I'd heard that, I was saying, well, where is the officer of the day? And he heard me, and he said, I'm right here, Lieutenant. He was a major. He had his armband on and the gun. And I said, well, Major, what's going on here? He said, well, these men are trying to sit all over the theater, and that's not the rule down here. You have to be segregated, and that's the way it is, and that's the way it'll be. So I said, well, where can I get in touch with the base commander? He said, not until tomorrow. He's not on base, but I'm in charge here until he comes back on base. And you men just going, you're not up north now. You have to do what customers down here in the south. So I said to the men, I said, well, you've heard what we said. We have to wait till tomorrow to talk to the base commander. Some of the men said, well, can I at least get my money back? It was 15 cents to see the movie. And I asked the major, I said, what about that? He said, well, okay. He told the sergeant, refund those who wanted their money. Some of them took the money and threw it in the dirt. So I'll be damned, I don't want this money, you know. They need it for a course in courtesy or something. Well, the next day, the base commander called an officer's call, and he made it quite plain that that's the way things were going to be. Well, we knew that we were in a catch basket, you might say. So people began to write to people in Washington, there's Congress people and lawyers and so forth. We took the precaution not to mail the letters on base, but to take them off base and mail them hither and yon. So they couldn't be intercepted and so forth, censored. Well, I said at the beginning it was a painful experience for me because when I saw something on that base, I just cracked. I'd been trained to be a pretty good, but before I went to the military, I was a pretty disciplined person from my upbringing. But in addition to that, I had had the 8 months of military training. But I saw German prisoners of war on that base that could do things that we couldn't do. Now, we had been fighting the Germans, 8 of us. We had returned from the States from having defended the country as we raised our right hand and swore to do. And in our country, the enemy could do things we couldn't do. 60 years later, I find it very hard to maintain my composure as I relate that. I just became so enraged and so undisciplined that I decided that somebody has to show the bigots that we can fly. They don't think we can fly. They don't think we can defend this country. And they don't think that we're first-class citizens like anybody else. And so I decided to demonstrate our ability by leading a flight of 3 of the guys and myself in P-39 flying low across the base.
Now, my mother was very Orthodox.
Well, this is a stunning piece of footage, I think. Obviously from a much longer interview, and I'm sure many of you who teach can think of ways to fold something like this into your classes. The first way that I've done it is in my World War II class, to complexify the narrative of the good war, which I don't jettison, certainly, because in many ways I think it was, if not a good, certainly a necessary war. But there are these stories which make it more complicated, and to learn, for students to learn about the Double V project, victory over the enemy abroad and victory over racism at home, and to talk about the Red Cross segregating blood, and to talk about the violence that greeted many African American GIs when they came back to the States, particularly but not only in the South, and their fatal mistake sometimes of having stepped out of place by wearing a uniform. While Colin Powell reminded us of some of this some years ago, these are still stories that are not told enough as we think about World War II. It seems to me that this illustrates how stories bring alive sites of memory, like Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site. If a cultural geographer from Mars came to the United States in 1950 and came today, the changes in our historic landscape are absolutely stunning. Sites in which ordinary people are understood to make history. Sites that tell the story of women making history. Sites that tell the story of all kinds of minority groups making history. Sites that have taken on some of the most indigestible stories that we tell of spectacle lynching are now part of our national historic landscape. The Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, now part of our national historic landscape. I have far too many students who too easily say, well, we just whitewash all of our history. Well, in some ways, we might whitewash some of it, like every country does, but we do a pretty incredible job of including in our National Historic Landscape these sites of conscience from which people can think. And Tuskegee National Airmen Historic Site is part of the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, which include over 185 sites around the world. What could be more crucial at this time in every nation's life to have these sites that remind us of conscience? And here's from their mission statement. Our members are diverse in every sense. They range from long-standing historic sites to emerging memory initiatives, remember a wide variety of histories, and address an equally wide range of issues. But they are united by their common commitment to connect past to present, memory to action. I think a video like this opens out for us to think about the increasing importance of the African American historic landscape, the excavation of slave quarters, populating interpreter programs at former plantations and presidents' homes with slaves, and calling them enslaved people, not servants, and not talking about in the passive voice, Jefferson's home was built. Instead saying enslaved people built Jefferson's home. That's a huge difference between the active and passive voice. Sites of lynching, marking sites of lynching, uncovering graves that have been ignored for a couple of hundred years, naming people who were lynched. I mean, naming is a way of personalizing and remembering that these were human beings. I think about the slave castles in West Africa as pilgrimage sites. The late historian Nathan Huggins called these places, it's a wonderful, wonderful phrase, points of departure, not arrival. Places of despair rather than liberty. They are, he said, the few physical remains of the traffic in human beings that brought many Americans, Black Americans, to the United States. They are, he declared, as much a part of our nation's history as Plymouth Rock. Think about the importance, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this today. Think of the importance of the infamous grocery store in Money, Mississippi, where Emmett Till was murdered for allegedly whistling at a white woman. I visited there some years ago when the store was in great disrepair, and it was important as a ruin. It was important to be remembered because it had been forgotten, if that makes any sense. And we see both the promise of a site like this being remembered, but we also see within the last few years that the historic marker that tells you what happened at this grocery store is often riddled with bullets, to the point where, as I understand, they have to put up a bulletproof sign. That also is part of our living historic landscape. All right, let me move on, and please collect thoughts, questions, reactions. This is from testimony at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial.
Mrs. Orlewska was deeply religious, and she respected my mother's religion also. She knew that it had to be kosher. So she took one pot, which she said she'll scrub it up real good, and she won't use any fat at all. So she cooked potato soup for us every single day. She browned some flour first, never touched, and she had one spoon. She bought a new spoon, and she had this one pot, which she always used only for us. My mother didn't have any unkosher food for the duration of the hiding. Never in her life, for that matter. But this is how she respected my mother's religiousness. And my mother would say, take a little money from this. She would not accept. And Mama would say, take a little money when you go to Mass and give it to the poor. And she would say, there are no poorer people than you. You children have no fresh air. You have no light. You have no freedom. Nobody is poorer than you. She wouldn't take a penny. Never. She never took a penny. She did it out of the goodness of her heart. She was incredible. And we didn't even have a chance to thank her. Because after the war, not after the war actually, after the liberation, when my mother went back to her, and just to tell her that we're going back to our hometown, and she says, please, don't stay in touch with me. Don't ever come back. I don't want my neighbors to see you. I'm afraid for the safety of my life. My Polish people, my Polish brothers, will not forgive me for saving a Jewish life. She was in jeopardy, and we never could say thank you.
It was a mood of expectation, and since it was a Friday evening, after darkness fell in, one of the elderly ladies remembered that she had taken some candles along, and she was lighting the candles and saying the prayers, and we found this somehow encouraging, and though it's so absolutely irrational, almost irrational, that here, but nobody knew about it, that 95% of the people on that train would not live to see the next evening. But nevertheless, people praising God for what?
Polish children are going to be killed the same day. And as soon as my mother heard that, she had presence of mind to run down, and I was next to my mother, and I couldn't really believe that this could possibly be true, but she ran over to my sister, removed the child from her arms, and told her, darling, I just found out that women with children will have it very easy. All they will do, they will take care of the children, but young people will be sent on hard labor, and I'm not so young, I'll never be able to survive hard labor. So she was trying to make my sister believe that by giving her the child, she's going to help her. Before my sister had even a chance to resist or to say, no, I don't want to give the child up, my mother had the child in her arm, and she was pushed to the side where all the women with children and older people were standing.
Cecilia's mother gave her daughter Mina, age 22, a chance to live by taking Mina's young son Danny into her arms. This photograph is of Cecilia's mother, Liza, and Danny shortly before they were gassed.
My mother had only a chance to yell out to me, please take care of your sister. My name was Silly. This is how she called me. And she called out, Silike, take care of your sister. Because she knew the pain my sister will suffer, and she'll find out where she took her grandson.
It was a tremendous click as the gates closed, sort of a finality. And there stood a woman, clad all in black. And she was literally barking. I've never heard a human voice being that harsh. She looked like a bulldog, and I said, this is going to be absolutely the worst. We were supposed to refer to her as Frau Kügler. She turned out to be the hope, the inspiration, and the knowledge that perhaps not all Germans were cruel. She was a decent, wonderful, warm, caring human being. No doubt she was picked for her position because of her looks, but her looks completely belied what was underneath it all. She was decent, she was good. We stayed in that camp for a little over a year. No one was sent to Auschwitz. I don't know if she particularly loved us, but she pinned a lie to the lips of all those who said they had no choice. I personally am indebted to her for my own life at one point, when this infamous Lindner was known for his cruelty, swooped down to him for an inspection of the camp. And I had been very ill at the time. I was running a very high fever, and I was permitted to stay in my bunk. And she came in, there were three of us who were ill. And she came and she said, "Girls, get yourself together." And I remember I had my skiing boots. See, my father made me wear my skiing boots when I left home, skiing boots in June. And I blessed him for it, because I wore those boots for 3 years in every season. I remember she stooped down to tie my boots, and she literally dragged me and the two other girls to the factory. She had worked in the factory before. And she set my looms in motion, and she said, "Pull yourself together, this is life or death today."
When I was arrested by Gestapo, and I was in this camp, my mother, who was in Budapest at the time, was approached that if she became an informer, they would rescue me, they would get me, which wasn't incidentally true, but it was a setup. She was on false papers, and she refused. And I'm proud of it.
That morning I went to look for Susie, because Liesl said to me, "Susie went out to get some water and she has not returned." So I went out to look for her. And I found her near the pump. I thought she had fainted, but I touched her. She was gone. I wanted to tell her, "Susie," and I did tell her. I said, "Susie, we're liberated, we're free." We had made a bet more than 3 years earlier on a train which took us to camp. A bet for a quart of strawberries and cream to be payable after the war. I said we would be liberated. And she said we would not.
This film was done for the museum around 3 themes: resistance, rescue, and defiance. And all, I think, are there. But we also see, we also see survivors taken into the wormhole of memory, into a different time and a different world. And think about what they said. Never being able to say thank you. A world in which a mother takes a grandchild to their death to save her daughter. A world in which a son is proud that his mother refused a trap to save him. The way that the Holocaust explodes on people's faces. I think about the work of Lawrence Langer, who has been extraordinarily influential for me, and in particular his book, Holocaust Testimonies, The Ruins of Memory, a book that rebukes the often popular assumption that memory work is by definition redemptive, constructive, and the troubling word, healing. You listen to the categories and a brief description of each of the categories of memory that he uses in his book, and think if there's any evidence of these in what you have just seen. In Langer's work, we unearth a mosaic of evidence that constantly vanishes into bottomless layers of incompletion. First, anguished memory. The seeds of anguished memory, he writes, are sown in the barren belief that the very story you try to tell drives off the audience you seek to capture. Very often in oral histories of the Holocaust and other events as well, if an interviewer is not experienced, they will attempt to turn what are stories of loss and meaninglessness into narratives of redemption and heroism. And it's often the interviewee who sort of has to do battle with the interviewer, say, no, that's not what I'm talking about. The frustration of lack of common ground between the reality of the Holocaust and our attempts at imagination. You must understand. You can't understand. Anguished memory, Langer writes, stains the desire for graceful aging with the refuse of annihilation zones and slaughter areas. 2, humiliated memory, an especially intense form of uncompensating recall, Langer says. Instead of restoring a sense of power or control over a disabling past, it achieves the reverse, reanimating the governing impotence of the worst moments, subverting what Langer calls the monumental view of the past that is so popular, a stress on individual courage, faith in humanity, private will, the resolute deed, the triumph of the spirit. He writes about the allure of preferred narratives, the way we make stories that are indigestible, digestible. And this is a paragraph that I read very, very early on when I was working on the Holocaust Museum project. And I read it so many times early on, it was sort of branded into my memory. And I think it was one of the most important paragraphs for me through the Holocaust Museum project, through the Oklahoma City project as well. When we write of martyrs instead of victims, focus on resistance instead of mass murder, celebrate the human spirit and bypass the human body, invoke the dignity of the self and ignore its humiliation. We are initiating the evolution of preferred narratives that use embattled words to build buffers of insulation against the terrors of the Holocaust, without bringing us any closer to its complex and elusive truths. Humiliated memory, Langer tells us, insists that while we may learn about the Holocaust, this learning cannot promote life. 3, tainted memory. A memory stained by the witness's own present moral sensibility. Langer says the survivor does not travel a road from the normal to the bizarre back to normalcy, but from the normal to the bizarre back to normalcy so permeated by the bizarre encounter with atrocity that it can never be purified again. Think of the ending of Maus, too, where Art Spiegelman's father, Vladek, asks him to turn off the tape recorder. I am tired from talking, Richelieu, and it's enough stories from now, identifying Art Spiegelman as his other son, murdered in the Holocaust. I think about, in addition to this wonderful, incredibly compelling oral history of the Chernobyl disaster, Voices of Chernobyl, in which the tainted memories of women who gave birth at that time, midwives said, gave birth to nightmares that mothers had that she had never ever heard before. Mothers who had nightmares of giving birth to deformed children, to monsters. And the midwife said, never heard these before Chernobyl. Those are examples, I think, of tainted memories. There are others. Those are the only ones that I want to talk about tonight. All right, so this third set, it's about 6 minutes long, is first responders from Oklahoma City.
I was actually sitting in a barber chair getting my hair cut, and the news flash came over the TV.
And there was very sketchy, vague information of building. There had been a large explosion in Oklahoma City, and at that point, of course, it was unknown what had happened or why.
That afternoon when I got home and turned the television on and watched the news, I just couldn't believe what I was seeing.
Like everybody, I guess, in the country, we had a hard time believing that this would happen first on American soil, and also that it would happen in a place like Oklahoma City.
I wanted to go. It's what I trained for.
Our 64-person task force was activated actually on Sunday, and we went out of Andrews and flew into Oklahoma City. We flew into Tinker Air Force Base, and our first impression was just an average American skyline. We were driving down a highway, and the first image you had of anything that was wrong was headlights. Everyone, as a show of support, was driving around with their headlights on. When we turned the corner, my first approach to the Mirror building was just the amount of devastation.
There was just damage for blocks. It was just amazing to me that a bomb could do that.
The roof of one of the buildings completely blown off, the glass blown out of buildings for blocks away. It wasn't just seeing that building, but everything else combined with it that you didn't see.
Despite all of the work that we had done and all the drilling, we weren't prepared. Nobody was. You had a fairly confident, highly skilled, well-trained group of rugged individuals that turned that corner, and you could not hook it with a feather.
From the time we get there until the time we leave, our sole purpose is to find someone alive in that building.
There were people on that pop 24 hours a day in an active rescue. When you're doing a rescue effort, you're literally hand-picking it to make sure you don't do any further damage to someone who may be there.
We worked side by side with the Oklahoma City firemen.
These guys had been on that pile out there. We called them the ants because they were on that pile from the moment it happened until after we left.
We had specialized tools and equipment and training in how to remove the concrete, remove large slabs, cut small holes, what have you, and use searching devices.
It was an emotional roller coaster because you get your hopes up that maybe one of the sounds that you heard on one of the listening devices or one of the things that you saw on one of the cameras might be a live victim. We never lost the hope that there would be somebody else in that building alive that we would find.
Oklahoma City Fire Department wanted to specifically remove every victim from the building. They felt that these were their citizens and they wanted to take them out.
The daughter of an Oklahoma City firefighter had been killed in the building. And when we discovered her body and when they were removing her body, we shut the site down. Just out of respect for a brother firefighter.
That is probably the hardest thing about this incident is we were not able to rescue anyone from the structure.
It was amazing that during a time when so many people were hurt and so many people were emotionally involved with what happened out there, that they could pull together and act as a team, come together and as a family and support the rescuers and support all the people that were working out there, and also support the families of the injured and the people who lost their lives.
I'll never forget when we checked in that night, they said, okay, you're going to be on this third floor up here in this large room. And they took the cots up there, and these women said, well, we'll make those cots up for you. And to us, that was very strange. I mean, here we're in a city who's been devastated. I mean, they have 160 some of their people missing. And there are these ladies here who literally want to make up our cots for us.
They had volunteers that would come and pick up our dirty clothing, take them home, launder them, and bring it back. So by the time we woke up, all our clothing was laundered.
We had one of our guys walking around one night, and a lady stopped who was one of the ladies cleaning tables. And she says, can I get you anything? Do you need anything? And he looks at her utterly incredulous because there's absolutely nothing you could have asked for. And he's bald. And he goes, well, you know, I could use a haircut. And he laughs and chuckles and moves on. We came in from the site the next day, and they had a barbershop set up.
They gave you, I mean, they would give you anything. They'd give you the shirt off their back if they thought it would help you.
They just came together, and instead of that bomb destroying that city, it brought out so much love in that city that it was overwhelming. And that is what, I will never forget about that, is the way those people in that city came together.
The people of Oklahoma City and the firefighters that work in Oklahoma City are the strongest people that I've ever met.
I was talking with students in class today about the different narratives, the different storylines that one can tell the story of Oklahoma City or many things. And it's one of the things that I tried to do in my book was to write about all of them. And they were all braided together, and they're all accurate to one degree or another. One is one we've become familiar with after 9/11, a narrative of civic renewal. Yes, it was horrible, but that there's this kind of collective effervescence after a tragedy, and that somehow the memory of the tragedy, if we activate it right, will be as transformative as the tragedy itself. And as I mentioned in class today, for me anyway, I don't see how it ever can be, because when people are gone forever. But it's not a narrative that is without substance. People in Oklahoma City came down to the site where people were working, poor people in old cars, bringing clothes and bringing food. It was an extraordinary outpouring of caring in Oklahoma City. So you'd have to be utterly cynical to not think about that. But it wasn't the case that this tragedy that for a little while trumped race and trumped all the kind of other ways that separate us. There was a African-American city councilwoman who I spoke with. This is now 2.5 years after the bombing. And I asked if some of that sort of sense of community stayed because like most American cities, Oklahoma City had serious racial issues. And she put it this way, she said, well, for a while, it was there, and then everyone went home. A very interesting way of putting it, I think. But that's one storyline that you can use to tell. We'll rebuild, we will build better, we'll modernize, so forth and so on. Okay? Another narrative was a narrative of religious redemption, that different faith traditions turned to the religious resources of their faith to grapple with the problem of evil, to grapple with suffering, to try and make sense out of this through different traditions. Okay? A third narrative, and it's very interesting, Oklahoma City, conservative evangelical community, often called the buckle of the Bible Belt, but the dominant language there, very much like after 9/11, was, I think, a very problematic language of therapy, a language of healing and closure. And the last word, in particular, one that I've come to despise. That these people, family members, those people who worked in the building with others, were patients. And their illness narrative was one that had to be cured by the new high priests of the culture, who were therapists. And there were people who bitterly rejected this because they understood their narratives to be ones of political violence, and that they weren't patients, right? They were agents in the story. And so they turned to the arts. They turned to poetry and music and theater and all kinds of activist activities to not just be seen as passive victims. Think about this language of healing process, that there's some regular process that people go through, and at the end of it, you're fine. Or that grief is somehow measurable. I'll tell you a story. I'll tell you several stories, actually. And this one's about the first Christian church in Oklahoma City, where all family members went to be notified of their loved one's death. And it was kind of a complex process. When their loved one was identified, and this was a real challenge because there were very few whole bodies in the mirror building. They were taken up to the third floor. There'd be someone from the coroner's office, there may be a clergy person, and sometimes there would be a mental health professional. And so this one African-American family was told that their loved one had been found, and the mother's form of expression of grief was physical, which is not an American sort of comfortable way of expressing grief, right? So she lay on the floor, and she was crying and screaming with passion and grief, and the clergy people had to hold off a mental health professional from giving her a shot. People who grieved too long, whatever too long means, were considered to be ill. They needed to be cured. Now, what we know, of course, from the wars of the 20th century, at least in Europe, I don't know about the rest of the world, is grief becomes part of the identity of a person forever. But this is not the American way, is it? We want people to get better. It's part of the redemptive narrative. We do not have a good language, certainly not a good memorial language, for the enduring nature of the chronic condition. So that was another narrative. And then the fourth one, reflected in the title of my book, The Unfinished Bombing, Oklahoma City in American Memory, was the toxic narrative. The way that the bombing lives on in enduring ways for so many people. It's like a fingerprint. It lives on differently for everyone. And it lives on differently for people whom we really don't think about when we focus on, say, first responders. We don't think about the guy who was in a kind of tractor contraption taking his life into his hands, the building swaying back and forth. I mean, it was a terminally ill building. And this guy is working, and for 3 days, he had to work in an area where a young child was pinned against the wall in a position like this, with his eyes open, looking at him. We don't think about a minister who, at a christening some years after the bombing, ran out of the church when he was asked to hold the infant. And everyone was stunned, and somebody went up to him and said, you were volunteering, weren't you, at the miracle? He said, yes. What was your job? He said he was bringing out parts of children's bodies out of the daycare center. And someone in the room said, I doubt he'll ever be able to hold a child again. We don't think about a friend of mine who worked in the public library in downtown Oklahoma City, 3 blocks from the Mirror building. And she was getting juice ready for a children's hour for children from the Mirror building and children from the YMCA, kitty corner across the street. And years after the bombing, she went up into the stacks and she would open a book and glass would tinkle down on the floor, and she was back on April 19th, 1995. These are the kinds of stories, part of the ways that the bombing lives on. Think about how the bombing lives on after 9/11. 9/11 is not over. It's not anywhere near over. There are now more people have died who were working on the site from the toxic effects of the site than were killed in the attacks. And those numbers are going to grow hugely in the next years. So let me give you, and I think I'll probably close with this. Here's the enduring power of preferred narratives in Oklahoma City. And I'm going to take you to April 19th, 2000, 5th anniversary of the bombing, dedication of the Memorial Center. President Clinton, who had come the Sunday after the bombing was on a Wednesday, and spoke magnificently there. So even people in this ultra-conservative town had an affection for the president. He came also to speak at the dedication of the memorial on the anniversary, and I was there that day. So listen to what he had to say. There are places in our national landscape so scarred by freedom's sacrifice that they shape forever the soul of America. Valley Forge, Gettysburg, Selma. This place is such sacred ground. The end of the quote. These words grated on me. However well-meaning, they seem profoundly misleading. These people's lives were not given in an act of conscious sacrifice for their nation. They were taken in an act of mass murder. The landscape to which Oklahoma City and the 9/11 sites is connected is not Valley Forge, Gettysburg, and Selma, but sites of political terrorism and mass murder. The 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. The McDonald's in San Diego. Columbine High School. And I haven't even updated this sentence because I just don't want to. It's too painful. Pam Witcher, wife of a Secret Service agent murdered in the bombing, someone who I came to know, an absolutely remarkable woman. I worried that perhaps I was being too critical of the president. They had moved from Washington. He was, as I remember, on President Clinton's detail. And they moved to Oklahoma City just before the bombing, but he was still in the Secret Service. So I wrote Pam and I asked her about the president's words and whether sort of my take on it was a little too harsh. And this is her response. I think it's one of the most remarkable things I've ever read. You are right that my husband was always prepared to give his life for others. He once told me that he believed he would die young in the line of duty. I do not think this was in any way an honorable or constructive way to die, or what any law enforcement person would choose as a way, and she put this in quotes, to give his life. Here's where my anger comes in, she writes. He was always prepared to defend the innocent or put his life on the line to protect. He was given the opportunity to do neither in this situation. I believe we heal better, she writes, when we accept the truth. This was nothing more than a damn waste of lives, all the more worthy of our heartbreak, and the families all the more worthy of our sympathy. Her response is, I think, a magnificent example of the integrity of memory. How someone seared with recent loss has the moral courage to resist the allure of preferred narratives. Well, no conclusion to this talk, folks. I guess it ends in sort of the same spirit that Claude Lanzmann's Shoah ends, with the trains going down the tracks. I appreciate very, very much your kindness in coming out tonight to engage difficult subjects. It's good of you to do so. Thank you for that. I'll be happy to stay for those who would like to visit with you about this. So thank you very much. Yeah, of course.
All right, so we'll do a Q&A. So I guess I'll leave it to you to navigate unless you need.
If any of you need to leave, feel free. You won't offend my delicate sensibilities at all. But again, this is only the second time I've thought about these things together, so I'm interested in your reactions, questions, thoughts.
Thank you. It was very moving. I just was wondering, what is it, do you think, about humans, and maybe particularly Americans, that they have this need to generate preferred narratives? Why? I mean, is it just American optimism?
I repeat the question.
Sorry.
Thank you. What is it about perhaps us that insists upon happy endings, redemptive narratives? Is it American optimism? Perhaps, you know, it's been such an incredibly long time since we've experienced war in the way most of the rest of the world experienced war. When we say we lost the war in Vietnam, I'm waiting for people to say, but we didn't lose the war in Vietnam the way people around the rest of the world lost whatever we were, right? We didn't see our homes destroyed. We didn't see our families out in the streets. It's a very different thing. I don't know that I have a really good answer to that. I know that even today when I'm watching, you know, a movie or something, I kind of want there to be a happy ending to the whole deal. But this insistence throughout the whole Holocaust Museum project, this insistence that somehow the Holocaust means something, and that it means something consolatory or redemptive. Those of you who know the building, the Hall of Remembrance, the hexagonal building, originally Jim Freed, the architect, the limestone windows, the big, were brick, evocative of the ghetto. And the Commission of Fine Arts and the National Capital Planning Commission have to sort of, anything in the monumental core, they have to vet. And the minutes are astonishing because you go, wow, you know, Mr. Freed, you've made this very powerful statement, but couldn't you instill some hope in the building? And he goes, I'm building a Holocaust museum. It's not about hope. And they wanted these brick windows gone. And eventually the building was reduced in size, and I mean, there's an example of, how this stuff worked. Linking much too closely. I don't think the museum does, but certainly people do, the Holocaust with the birth of Israel. It's really a problematic way to understand this. Yeah, so there we are. Not a great answer to your question, Mark, but
No, it's okay.
thanks. Please.
So thank you for a wonderful talk. Many questions when I try to limit myself to maybe 1.5. So I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about the politics of memory. So I noticed in your introduction you spent really brief time for first two and a lot on the last instance, which is Oklahoma bombing. And when I think about the ways in which we talk about certain kinds of memories, how frequently in the national scene in the US, but also international context as well, you hear a lot about injustice done to African Americans or Holocaust. Those are huge issues, whereas Oklahoma bombing may not have that kind of the sort of status that the other instance might have. So I wonder if you can kind of comment on that, and in connection with that, if you can say something about your positionality as an interviewer, that would be very interesting to me. So you are who you are. You kind of talked about how there is this sort of impossibility of knowing the experience of the person that you are interviewing, and that's something that we all experience one way or another. But of course, there are other things like race, gender, or nationality, or the way you talk, even your body language, that may, or that actually does shape a lot of what we're hearing. So in relationship to the politics of memory, how you sort of, think about your own positionality as somebody who is listening and maybe conducting into this.
Yeah, thanks. So, questions about the politics of memory, what gets raised to the level of what counts in our memory struggles, and then about the position of the interviewer. I have to say this. I would get. Let me ask the second one first. I would get embarrassed sometimes because I would get invited to these conferences on oral history, like to talk about the Holocaust Media Project and mostly about Oklahoma City. I didn't have any training in oral history. And I would think, for a long time I thought about interviewing people. When I got to Oklahoma City, people there talked about visiting with people, to visit with people. And that's a huge difference, isn't it? For me anyway, interviewing, it's a kind of information extraction, sort of like a sea lamprey, You're there to suck the story out of somebody and you move on. Visiting with people implies a kind of mutuality, a sharing of experience, a bumping up, and that made a lot more sense to me. So I just tried to listen really carefully, and I don't know what else to say. Besides that, it was really difficult at times, but I felt when it was really difficult, I thought, I can't do much more of this. I would think, okay, you made a commitment to be a kind of scholarly witness to the power of this and that. And so you owe it to the people that you have visited with to try and convey the power of what they have seen, even though you can't approach, their world. And I mean, the stories they're stunning. They just go on and on and on. It's absolutely stunning. And the same was true in the 10 years that I worked on Flight 93, even though I didn't write about it so much. The only thing I guess I'll say, lots been written about the politics of memory. I worry sometimes, and this is not original with me, that if the Holocaust becomes our model, what about all the stuff that doesn't rise to the level of the Holocaust, but is still really significant violence, for example? How do we memorialize that? There are areas of violence that we're only, I think, beginning to think about how to memorialize. Lynching, for example. Sexual violence, we don't do a particularly good job of memorializing that, and my goodness, is that a fertile ground for preferred narratives? I don't know if any of you know this wonderful, wonderful book. It never got much attention. I'm not sure why, and it never came out in paperback. It's got a great title. It's called Working with Available Light by Jamie Calvin, K-L-V-N. And it's the husband's account of their family experience after the rape of his wife when she was running along the lake shore in Chicago. And it's a stunning, stunning book for so many reasons. But one of them, it just shows how this just goes on and on. And yet, her friends would come to the house and impose their own kind of more digestible narratives onto her experience, which did even more violence to what she had been through. And he wrote a magnificent comment from a writer whose name I can't remember, maybe some of you recognize her, that he realized in writing this book, and he obviously did it with her permission, that he was a person who still had the privilege of ordinary heartbreaks. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Anyone else at all? Sir?
You mentioned early on the problem a survivor, particularly a survivor of mass murder, had in that people they would speak to, they felt must understand.
Yeah.
And people they're speaking to can't understand.
Yeah.
And I was going to take a bit of an exception to that with you.
Okay.
So, to me, there was an example in the 70s of a TV series called, I think, The Holocaust, where they shrank that experience onto the history of one particular family.
Right.
And doing that, I think, made that experience digestible to people who were not survivors. Not entirely, but certainly went part of the way. And I wonder if you think that sort of thing, movie people do it all the time, is part of the solution to the problem.
Yeah, that's great, because these are ongoing issues in Holocaust studies. This was the NBC miniseries, The Holocaust, in 1978.
70-something.
And there were a lot of people who said, look, we know it's on television, for heaven's sakes, how bad can it be? But that maybe it would say to people, oh my God, I got to learn more about this, I have to read. So does it possibly build bridges? Yeah, I certainly would say it can. To stand as a compelling representation of the Holocaust, I sort of have, Elie Wiesel wrote an incredible op-ed about this, because one of the problems was, I don't know if you remember, and this would cause a lot of controversy, is there was a place in the film where they were talking about the smell from the crematorium, and they went immediately from that scene to an ad, it's unbelievable, of an American housewife complaining about the smell of fish in her kitchen. Now that, I don't know, sort of does something to one's brain. It's just weird. But you're absolutely right. If you want a wide public to at least come a little bit of the way down the road, you've got to reach out to them in ways, but it makes those ways really important, how you do it. Thank you for that. Well, everybody, thank you very much.
I have no other words. I echo Professor Linenthal. Thank you very much for coming, and we hope to see you at other Jewish Studies events this semester.
I would have said something as soon as I got back.